Hello, friends. A little over 30 years ago, way back in the heat of a Kansas summer in the 1980s, I attended the Midwestern Music Camp at KU in Lawrence, Kansas. It was hands down one of the best experiences of my life, and 3 decades later, I'm still very close friends with several people I met there. One of those people was a bassoon player who I immediately bonded with. We shared the same sarcastic sense of humor, love of girls, video games, and a bit of rebellion that got us into some good-natured trouble now and again. His name is Jared Holroyd, and this episode is not about him. However, it is about his dad. With no further ado, welcome to the Memories of a Moonbird podcast, exploring life one story at a time. Hello friends, I'm Daniel Sherrill. Today, what a fascinating show. For over 50 years, he's been taking care of people in ways that would make most everybody a little uncomfortable. As a funeral director, he's helped literally thousands and thousands of human beings through grief and the process of losing someone they loved. Now retired, he was kind enough to sit with me and talk about his journey, his perspective on the world, and what it was like to work around death for most of his life. Get ready for a really fun and poignant conversation with our family friend and one of the nicest people you could ever meet, zooming in from Topeka, Kansas, Mr. Fred Holroyd. Fred, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Such a pleasure to have you here. Let's jump right in. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in a very small community in southern Kansas, a little community of less than 2,000 people. Was raised on a 35-acre farm outside of that little town and lived there until I left home.
Was that a working farm?
My father worked actually in town at a grain elevator, but we had cows and hogs and sheep and goats and horses and it was not a working farm. It was, Dad milked a couple of cows and we fed the hogs, and pretty typical southeast Kansas small farm.
And did you guys eat some of your own animals, or you said you got milk from them and whatnot?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, Dad would take a fatted steer to the butcher shop and they'd fix it for you, or a hog, or of course, chickens.
What year were you born?
I was born in 1943, so I'm a child of the 50s, really.
Yeah, right, just at the tail end of the war.
Yeah, things were pretty simple. I mean, as I was growing up, even though the Korean conflict was going on by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I don't remember anything like that happening. There's nothing in my memory that I knew anything was going on in the world, except we were just having a good time on the farm.
And what was little Fred like?
Well, Henri, I think I was mischievous. I didn't hurt anybody or hurt anything particularly. I didn't break too many windows or anything, but I certainly had a good time. I had an older brother, and he and I just had a great time together, and had a little sister that we tried not to pay too much attention to, but we were just pretty typical kids, I think.
And are they still here with us today?
My sister is in lives in Illinois, and my brother passed away when he was 39 years old, so he's been gone a long time. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
When it comes to your line of work, which is very unique in the world, really,
Right.
There are terms like mortician, funeral director, funeral home. What is the correct term for what you actually did?
Well, we refer to ourselves as funeral directors. There are embalmers, which are most of us that have been in the funeral business a long time have a license, an embalmer's license, a funeral director's license. So we refer to ourselves as funeral home or funeral directors, and our facility as a funeral home. I'm retired. I spent well over 50 years as a funeral director and have been retired, but I guess you never totally retired, but
well, one day you will.
Yeah, one day
we all do.
One day
right?
we all will. That's one of the things I've learned is we're all going to retire.
So the term mortician, is that not used anymore, really?
A mortician is a correct term. It's an older term. Sort of went out of use probably 50 years ago in terms of, I think funeral directors are the people who changed a lot of those terms. Maybe they just liked the term funeral director more so than mortician.
Well, mortician sounds kind of a horror movie, you know?
Yeah, I kind of like undertaker, but then that's a really, really old term.
That also just sounds like either a wrestler or, Night of the Undertaker, some Friday night scary movie.
I always told people we undertake things that other people won't undertake.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that a bit here. But I'm curious, were there any particular experiences for you growing up that made you want to work as a funeral director?
Absolutely none. Absolutely none.
So tell us the transition. So you're a happy kid living a good life.
How'd that happen? Right? How'd that happen? I had a friend. I don't want to make this a long story, but I had a friend who was working. He was a year younger than me. He was about 15 or 16 years old, and I was a year older. And he was cutting grass and washing windows at the local funeral home. And he said to me one day, this guy's looking for somebody else to help, and you ought to think about that, because quite honestly, I was kind of tired of working, doing the farm stuff and hauling hay and those kind of things. And I said, well, but kind of fun. And he said, well, he's got an apartment at the funeral home, in the back of the funeral home, and we could live there. Here we are, 16, 17 years old, being able to live by ourselves. And so I went in and talked to him, and I thought, well, that'd be okay. Cut grass. And not only that, but he had an ambulance. In those days, a lot of funeral homes had their own ambulances. And as an ambulance driver, you could drive as fast as you wanted to. So 17 years old, and somebody tells me I can drive as fast as I want to. That seemed like a pretty good job. So that's really how I got into working around a funeral home, was just cutting the grass and cleaning the windows, and occasionally helping when somebody died. I got to where, they would ask you to help in the embalming process, and it never really bothered me. And so I suppose it just didn't bother me to do that. And the transition really came. I wanted to be a teacher. That was my goal in life, is to be a teacher and a coach. I was athletically involved, and so I always wanted to be a coach. And in those days, in the late 50s, early 60s, those professions were a dime a dozen. There was millions of people coaching and teaching, and people were getting out of that profession more than they were going into it. Mm. And when I started seeing people getting out, I was in college by then, and I thought, if these are people that I admire and they can't make it in that field, maybe I ought to be looking at something else. And I really admired the funeral director that I had worked for there while I was in high school, and I had met some other funeral directors, and I really admired them, and that's really what got me started thinking about the funeral industry.
So let me ask you this. So you're 16 years old, though, and you get offered an apartment with your buddy at the funeral home,
right,
and you're living there, and you're cutting grass and doing all the maintenance, basically, at the funeral home, correct?
Right.
And so you left home at 16 to go live in this place.
Right. I mean, that's another big...
Well, doesn't seem like that was very common back then, right?
Well, it wouldn't have been common, but it seemed like... if you're 16 or 17 years old and you can move out of your home, I mean, by that time, I think people that age, or maybe it's most guys, maybe, are pretty sure that their parents aren't the smartest people in the world anyway. And maybe they, as a 17-year-old, I probably knew, or I thought I knew more than my father did. I found out later I didn't.
Yeah, we all do that.
But to allow me to move out of my house and into town, which didn't amount to anything, but it was a big deal if you lived in the country, and be on your own, so to speak.
Yeah.
I had to, when school was going on, you had to get yourself up. You had to get to school. You had to, figure out what you were going to eat, unless you went back out to the farm and eat with your folks.
Well, yeah, I mean, I am completely surprised that your parents were like, yeah, okay, those are cool parents.
As I look back now, they were cool parents. I don't know that I thought that at the time, but
there's a lot of trust there,
Yeah, I think that's right. Plus, my parents, I don't think were much different than a lot of other people in that period of time. The idea of doing something other than getting a job, in other words, college did not seem like a big deal, I think, to them. Nobody in the family had ever gone to college. They didn't have any family had ever gone to college. And so the idea was go to high school. So I think maybe they're thinking, well, if maybe he gets a job at the funeral home, he'll get out of high school in a year or so, and he'll get a job.
So timeline though, you're growing up on the farm, then you go at 16, move out and go live at the funeral home. And then were you staying at the funeral home when you went off to college?
No. I once I got out of high school, I went away to college, to a town 50 or 60 miles away. Now I'm living in a dorm, or in an apartment, and was working, not only going to school, but I worked a little bit part-time for the funeral home over there. He'd get a death call at night, and he'd call me and to go with him and that kind of thing. So I still was doing a little, even though I was still thinking about teaching and so forth, I was still working around a funeral home.
And so then you graduate college?
So I graduated out of junior college. And by the time I graduated junior college is when I started, a little before that is when I realized that maybe the coaching profession and the teaching profession was not for me. And that's when I started thinking about going somewhere to go to mortuary college. Mortuary school is what they called it at that time. And I had met a funeral director or two in the town where I was, and I talked to them about it. They kind of gave me some ideas of some schools that were available. At that time, there weren't a whole lot of mortuary colleges out there.
And how long is the time you're in mortuary college?
It was just a 12-month school.
Okay.
So I went to San Francisco because I wanted to get as far away from home as I could. And when I'm 18 years old or 19 years old, and the idea of being in San Francisco in the early 60s at 19 years old seemed like a great idea to me.
That must have been a hell of a good time. Yeah.
And it was. Yeah, I had a good time. But I went to school, and I got out and went back to my hometown to work for that funeral director. He told me when I left home to go to California that you get out of school and you want to come back, just walk in the front door and you got a job. And I did.
And you've been in Kansas ever since, right?
Yeah. I stayed with him about 6 months, got an opportunity to go to Topeka, which seemed like, except for San Francisco, probably the biggest town I'd ever been in. So I went to Topeka in 1965.
And how did you meet your fantastic and awesome wife, Nidra?
Well, when I was spending that time working after school, after college, after mortuary school, I went back and was working at the funeral home. She had graduated from nursing school in Kansas City. She was from down in that same county where I was raised. We didn't know each other, but we were raised about 10 miles apart. Never knew each other. So she was working in the hospital in this little town where I was. Well, if you're working in a funeral home, you get acquainted with people who are working in the hospital.
Makes sense.
Because that's where a lot of deaths occur. Plus, I always told her there was only 2 single women in the whole town. And so I had to pick one of them. So I made a good choice.
So did you ask her out on a date?
Sure. Yeah. I went to a drive-in movie, very first date. Had to go 50 miles to find a drive-in movie, but we found one.
And you guys have been married for about 650 years now, right?
We've been married. If we make it to December, it'll be 55 years.
Oh, God bless you. That's awesome.
I know.
So more than 50 years of being in funeral rites, as they call them. What do you like most about what you do?
I think the thing that gave me more satisfaction, if you will, than anything else is just having families say to you, thank you. You've helped me through a terrible period of my life. One of the worst things that could happen, but losing someone. And if you've helped them kind of get through that, I think just the people. And then 6 months later, when you see somebody in the grocery store and they come up to you and say, I just remember so much of how nice you were to us when Dad died or when my husband passed or something. That's the greatest thing about the funeral industry, is helping people.
Now, when most people think of a funeral director or mortician, I think that they conjure up images of selling coffins and embalming or cremating bodies and funerals and all that stuff. What other things do you actually do?
We just simply make sure that there are certain things that have to be done. When a person dies, there's forms that have to be filled out. There's just things that have to be done. And helping people get that done. I mean, that's what we do. The rest of it is just I don't know. It's just part of it, but it's not the main. The caskets, the embalming, it all is part of it, but it's just a small part. The biggest part is just helping people. That's what it is.
Do you remember the first body you embalmed and what that was like?
No, I don't remember that at all. I remember the first time. I remember the first person that I saw going way back to when I was in high school working at that funeral home. I remember the first time I was asked to help with this lady that had died. I remember who that was. I remember that.
And that was your first time seeing a dead body?
Yeah, I think it was. As a child. Well, I mean, I had a grandparent or two that had died, and so I had seen them. But it certainly was the first time I'd ever been right there beside with the person that had died. Yeah.
And when you deal with a dead body, I mean, there's all kinds of questions that come up, like the body, I'm guessing, has to be cleaned. It has to be dressed and stuff. And so you're dealing with this. And by the time you're doing that stuff, is the body in rigor mortis and it's stiff?
Yeah. Because the body, the person has been embalmed by then. And so once the body's embalmed, then the protein in the muscle tissue kind of hardens, if you will. And so that's how come a body seems kind of stiff.
Are there any laws that say, like, all bodies in America have to be embalmed before they're buried, or can a person opt not to be?
No. And every state's different. But I don't know of any state that says a body has to be embalmed.
Have you experienced both? I mean, is there a percentage you would say of the people that do embalm versus don't?
Oh, yeah. The bulk of the most people, 90, again, remember things have changed over the last several years. But in terms of people who are going to be buried as opposed to cremated, probably 95% or more of those people are embalmed.
What does embalming actually do? What is the reason for it?
The reason for it is so that it delays decomposition, so that 2 or 3 days later or a week later or whatever, you can still have a funeral with a body present. Okay, and you're not going to have any problems with decomposition.
And that means both deterioration and smell and everything, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if I could do what you do, sir. I have to be honest. I think it takes a special kind of person.
Well, it probably does. You know, I tell people when they're talking about getting into the funeral business, younger people, that one of the first things you have to do is have a good sense of humor. And I say that not because we think death is funny, but if you don't have a good sense of humor, if you have a sense of humor, you can laugh at other things. You can laugh at what's going on, or what's happening in your life, or so forth. And if you don't have a good sense of humor, and you're too dark and too sober, I think it'd eat you up.
Yeah,
because you're around death all the time. You're dealing with, and I'm probably going to get into this later, but you're dealing with people dying that you know. You're dealing with children that have died. That's if you're a parent. I can remember as my sons were small. They're 3 or 4 years old, and I'm called to take care of a 3 or 4 year old child that got hit by a car, or they died of cancer or whatever. That's tough.
Yeah,
and that's hard. But you still got to have a sense of humor, not about that, but you got to be able to, that when you're through and you go home, you got to be able to laugh with the kids and so forth. So.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, what is the most challenging aspect of being a funeral director for you personally?
I think just dealing with death constantly. That's the most challenging thing. And not taking it, I want to say not taking it home with you. I mean, you have to be able to leave it behind and go about your business and go to the grocery store or go watch the kids play ball or whatever, and kind of get it out of your mind.
I'm curious, is the field of being a funeral director, is it diverse? Is it primarily men? Is there women who do what you do?
Well, it has changed, obviously, over the years. When I went to school in California, we had maybe 100 people or so in my class, and we had 2 of them were women. today, about 60% of the students in mortuary colleges across the country are female.
Why do you think the change?
I don't know, because I mean, to me, it hadn't been that long ago that nurses were all women. You go in a hospital now and you'll see a lot of men that are nurses. I've got a son that's a nurse. So doctors were weren't always men, but darn near always men. And I think there's many women that are doctors today. So attorneys, I mean, any profession, it just seems like has changed.
So like many other professions, yours is becoming much more diverse now.
Absolutely.
That's cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that working in and around death has made you more open or closed emotionally to the existence of a human being in life?
Oh, I think it's made me more open toward that. Yeah.
And I'm curious, do you cry?
Yeah, I cry. I don't. What you can't do is cry or be emotional when you're with a family. You may feel like crying, but you don't, because you can't help somebody through this if you can't get a hold of your own emotions. But yeah, I cry. I mean, parents died, and my brother died, and had friends that have died. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, since you mentioned your parents, working as a funeral director, how was the experience of losing them because of what you do? Do you think it was profoundly different than the average human being?
I think it probably was. I really do. You still grieve, you still mourn, but I think, I think you're able to kind of, I don't buck up, or something. I don't know that that's the right term, but I can remember when staying at the cemetery when everybody else had left, and I said, no, I'm just going to stay until they get everything done. I mean, I know what's going to happen, and I know, the burial and so forth, but nobody else wanted to stay, and I did, and it didn't particularly bother me to do that. Now I might go home, and as I think about that night, maybe I'm starting to think about it and tear up and so forth. But yeah, I think it's different for people who work in the death industry, probably.
Well, I have some questions that I think listeners would love to know the answers to. One of which is, have you ever had an experience or any kind of experiences with ghosts?
No, I never have. I talked to people that said they've seen ghosts. My wife claims she's seen a ghost, and I don't. I kind of laughed the first time she ever told me that, and I said, I'm not laughing at you particularly, but I've never experienced it. I've been around funeral homes. I obviously stayed in the funeral homes, not only when I was young, but throughout my career. You had times where maybe somebody had to work at night, so you'd volunteer to work at night, stay at the funeral home, and I've never had an experience with a ghost. No.
Do you believe ghosts exist?
I think, I don't know, and until I see one, I'm going to say no. I don't believe they exist. And that's what I told my wife. That's what I told Nidra. You say you've seen a ghost, but until I see one, I just can't believe it.
Fair enough. Proof is in the pudding, as they say, right?
Yeah. Maybe someday I'll realize what to do, but right now I don't think so.
Are you religious?
That's a hard question, because maybe I'm spiritual more so than religious. I think, I go to church. I don't go to church. Well, right now we don't go to church much at all, but we have always belonged to a church, gone to church. And when I was a kid, my folks took us to Sunday school, and they were what in the Christian churches call a C&E people, which means they went on Christmas and Easter. So my folks were, and so they took us and dropped us off, and then picked us up when Sunday school was over. So I've always kind of been around the church, and working in the funeral industry, you're around churches all the time. And so Nita and I have always been somewhat active in our church, and so I guess I'm religious. That is kind of a hard question. That's a tough question.
Well, really the question is, do you believe in God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in reincarnation? How do you feel about those things?
When I go, Nita and I snow skied for years and years and years. But we were skiing in our early to mid 70s. So we skied for a long time. And I always said that when I'm up on the top of a mountain, besides being kind of scared whether I ought to go down that slope or not, but I'm standing there and I'm looking out over this gorgeous scenery. I just think there has to be a God of some kind to do all this. Mm. So the afterlife, I like to think there is, and I hope there is, but I don't know that there is, and that probably doesn't probably wouldn't go well if I told my pastor that. I'm not sure there is an afterlife.
What about reincarnation? Do you think we come back?
I really don't believe in reincarnation, and I know there's some religions that do, but I don't believe in that. If there was, I've always told Nader that if there is such a thing as reincarnation, I want to come back as somebody's house cat because they sleep about 19 hours a day and somebody feeds them and waters them and fixes their litter box. But no, I don't believe in reincarnation.
Well, it's interesting because when my father died, I was there with him, and I remember very distinctly the moment he actually died and seeing the body, just being completely overwhelmed with, I mean, besides the obvious emotions of the loss, but being really quite surprised at how much it was obvious at that point that this was just a shell.
Right.
Very much like a sea animal leaving its shell behind and going off to live another thing.
Right.
I was very struck with, oh, okay, Dad's not here anymore. Like, he's definitely moved on. The person that was my father is now somewhere else, or he's either become, whatever you want to believe. He's in heaven, he's energy, part of the universe, he's whatever, but he's no longer here. This is just this shell. And and it actually gave me an incredibly beautiful sense of peace that I didn't expect at that time.
I get that. I was with my mother when she died, and so I understand what you're saying. And,
yeah.
But I think as a child, what we were taught, we went to a Baptist church, almost kind of like a Southern Baptist church, where kind of a little bit of hellfire damnation, and it was sort of beat into us that everybody, your grandparents and your parents, anybody that goes before you, are going to be watching everything you do. And so I can remember, because they're up there and they're watching you. And I can remember thinking, if I was doing something that was kind of honoring, I'm going, oh man, I hope they're watching me. I can't do this. I didn't want to. It was almost like put me on a guilt trip or something.
Yeah, I think I experienced a lot of that growing up as well too. To be honest with you, when you're a young boy and you're masturbating and you're thinking to yourself, God, if people in heaven are watching this, I guess
who's watching me?
I guess enjoy the show. Maybe, I don't know.
That's funny.
Do you, as a person who's worked with death, have you actually studied any of the different spiritual or philosophical beliefs on death from different cultures, like Eastern versus Western, et cetera?
Not a lot. I've dealt with families from different religions, and so I do think what little bit I've read about, like some of the Eastern religions, is that they seem to deal a little bit better, a little more out in the open with death, maybe, than some of the Western religions. I mean, and we, I've over the years have dealt with people who were Hindu or Muslims or I'm trying to think about any religion.
Has there ever been any kind of conflict or difficulty in dealing with the different aspects, or no?
No. I guess because I've just always felt like that it's their thing. What they want to believe is fine with me. It's a little bit different maybe if they want to throw rice around or, something, that's okay. I mean, that's their thing.
Yeah.
I've never had a conflict with it.
Well, it seems like working around death has given you the awesome perspective of live and let live from looking at you here,
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right.
And do you think that's important in life?
It is. It is to me. And I think I've tried to instill that in my kids, and I think it's probably worked. I don't know. I think.
What's something unique that you've seen in all your years of being a funeral director?
We've seen some really unique services and funerals and so forth. Biker funerals are the best funerals there are.
Why is that?
Oh, because they have such a good time. They drink a lot of whiskey, and they pass the bottle around, and once you get out to the cemetery, they're smoking joints and they're I mean, and they're just having, it's like a party.
Well, do you think that a funeral should be more of a celebration and a party of the?
I think it should be a celebration of somebody's life. By that same token, I don't like it when I hear people say, "Oh, don't cry." Well, I always say when I die, I hope somebody cries. I hope somebody misses me to the point that they cry a little.
Have you ever considered quitting?
No. Once I got into it, I really felt like I was doing something that was right, something that was good.
What is something about death or the process of grieving that maybe people don't know that you think they should?
I think people need to understand that everybody grieves. You grieve when somebody dies. You grieve, quite honestly, people grieve when people get divorced or something. There's some grief because people don't sometimes understand that grief. People don't mourn enough. Mourning being grief is inside, and everybody feels grief. But mourning is grieving outwardly. It's crying and it's talking about the person and it's sharing stories and still talking about them 6 months later. Some people will say, "Oh, don't mention John by name. That'll make them cry." But all that is mourning, and I think people don't always understand that people need to mourn, and so they get that grief out in the open.
I actually love the simplicity of that statement. Get the grief out in the open. I think that's a beautiful way of very simply saying what needs to be done. This actually leads beautifully into questions I have with you about how we deal with death today in America. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you, do you think that being a caretaker for the deceased has made you a better parent?
I don't know that it's made me any better parent. Maybe because I've grown to realize that this death can happen at any time to anybody. That maybe you learn to the value of life or the value of having the kids around. And
No, I mean, that's appreciating every day the value of time and not squandering your life. And I've tried very hard in my life not to waste any time on things and people and experiences that don't matter.
Yeah, that's right.
What's the most valuable lesson overall that you think you've learned from your career?
And I think that, that you have to learn to live every minute because you don't know whether that's going to be the last one. And I know that people say that all the time, but it is true.
Let's talk about the way that death is portrayed in our culture in America. To this day, I feel like American culture and society treats death almost like a taboo. And I think you and I are probably more aligned that I feel that we should be talking about death more as a culture.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, so you agree, how do you think we do that? How do we open up that conversation and tell people, hey, it's okay to talk about death?
Mr. Rogers had some really good, a really good idea, I believe, when he came to death. And he didn't talk about it on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but some quote, and he said, and I really like it. And he said, first of all, you got to understand that to die is to be human. Okay. So people don't like to talk about death, but it's human. And anything that is human is mentionable. And anything that's mentionable is manageable. Death is mentionable. And so when we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming and less scary. I'm not quoting him exactly, but I'm kind of paraphrasing what he said. And he said the people we trust with that important talk can help us to know that we're not alone. Mm. And so, I think he's absolutely right that people need to understand. I'm not sure how you get them to understand, but they need to understand that to die is human. I don't know how you get people to talk about it because it's scary to them. It's scary.
Yeah.
Maybe if I don't talk about it, it won't happen. And people need to understand it's going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that in life, the more you do something that's scary, the less and less scary it becomes.
That's true.
This goes back to an earlier podcast episode I had called Voices from Black America, where a woman named Alexia said the conversation must continue in earnest. And she's, of course, talking about the conversation about systemic racism and whatnot.
Right.
But that principle applies to almost anything, that the conversation, the human conversation, has to continue in earnest, and we have to not be afraid, or
Right.
even being afraid, we still need to talk to each other.
Yeah, I think all of us, if we're dealing with something that we just don't know anything about, we can be a little fearful. And sometimes you find out, once you learn a little bit about it, you find out. I think about one time I got a telephone call from a guy who was head of a group that I didn't even know we had in Topeka called ACT, and that stands for the Atheist Community of Topeka. And I got a call, and they wanted to know if I'd come up and talk to them about funerals. And I'm going, I don't know. Well, I said, yeah, I can do that. But I'm thinking to myself, man, what am I getting into? Because I've been dealing with churches and religious groups of some sort. I'm going to go talk to a bunch of people who have no belief whatsoever. And I'm not used to that, because I'm used to dealing with people that have some belief, or at least they think they do. They have a funeral. They may not have a church, but they always want you to call a clergyman to come in and be at the funeral. And I thought, I'm going to go deal with a bunch of people that's got horns and screwy things. And I know. So I walk into this place, and the first thing I noticed was 3 or 4 people in there I knew.
Oh, how funny.
Well, I'm thinking to myself, well, these are just regular folks. And so I talked to them just like I talked to anybody else about funerals and so forth. And I left thinking, yeah, it was kind of scary in a way for me to go talk to them. Well, it's not any different than anybody else. They've got the same concerns that everybody else does, except they're not worrying about an afterlife.
No, I mean, that's wonderful. What a great statement of living through the fear.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm curious, has technology changed how funeral homes deal with death? And if so, how? And if not, has it all stayed the same?
Today, funeral directors do so much on the computer. I mean, we used to you'd sit down and you'd talk to family, and everything was written down on a piece of paper, and you were writing obituaries, or you're gathering information so you can fill out a death certificate and notify the Social Security Administration or the Veterans Administration or whatever. But everything was done with a pencil, piece of paper. Now everything's done on a computer, and a funeral director is sitting in an office with a family, and they've got monitors, and they're doing their thing on the computer.
Well, do you cremate bodies the same way today that you did 100 years ago?
Well, yeah, you didn't start cremating bodies until about 30 years ago, but yeah, that's right. The crematories are a little more up to date. Doesn't take as long, but the embalming's just like it was when I started. There's no different than it was when I started.
Wait, so they only started cremating bodies 30 years ago?
We started in our part of the country. We started seeing it. I'd say maybe 40 years ago, so about the mid to late 70s, or maybe even the early 80s is when we started seeing cremation in our part of the country, in the Midwest, when we started seeing that change.
And do you think that they weren't doing it because of like the Holocaust and things like that? Or because, I mean, going back thousands of years, they were burning bodies on funeral pyres,
That was done in Europe. That was done in, the Vikings or people like that.
The Greeks, yeah, it goes way back to the Greeks and everything, yeah.
Yeah, but they didn't do it in this country.
Huh, that's fascinating.
They just didn't in our country. And you go back 200 years in our country, and you'd found no cremation. I mean, now 100 years ago, you might have a little cremation, maybe, but probably 60 or 60 years ago, we probably started seeing cremation on the West Coast, maybe a little bit back east, but mostly on the West Coast. And then you kind of started seeing it in the larger cities, the New York and so forth. You started seeing it, and everything in the Midwest was always kind of the last place, because things start on one of the coasts and it moves inward.
Sure.
Today, cremation, even right here in the heart of the country, cremation is probably 50 over 50%.
Wow.
It's the biggest change that I've seen in the funeral industry.
Now, do you want to be buried or cremated?
I don't want to be cremated. No, I don't have any particular reason to say that. I know a lot of funeral directors that have been friends of mine that have died and are being cremated. I'm just not quite ready for it yet.
I got to tell you, I don't want to be cremated or buried. I want my body thrown into space where it came from.
Well, that's you can do that, but you can do that. I think Elon Musk has a rocket that he's sending up there with but they got to be cremated first. So they put the cremated remains in there, and then they fly them up to space, and out they go.
Oh, funny. I've just decided I just can't ever die. I don't want to die. So
not long after I retired, and we never made a public statement about my retirement because I didn't want people to. But it kind of finally got around. A little lady at the grocery store one day, she said, I was down at your funeral home and they tell me that you retired. And I said, well, yeah, I did. I just thought it was time. And she said, what am I going to do? Because you were always the person to take care of me. Aww. And I said, best thing is just don't go. She said, how do I do that? I don't know. So there you go.
I agree. Just don't go.
Yeah, just don't go. We're having a great time.
There's too many cool things happening technologically. I want to see what the next great technology is.
See, that's the thing. And people ask me, you've been around death so much, maybe you're going to ask me that. Are you afraid of death?
I am. So save that for the end of the podcast.
All right.
Have you ever felt like you have everything figured out, like life, career, family? You've done all this great stuff. Do you have any kind of?
Absolutely not. And I know anybody that says they've got it all figured out is not telling you the truth. That's what I think.
Well, hey, your son, Jared, my friend. What's up, Jared? Spilled the beans about you behind your back and told me about a really cool project that you're involved with that's helping veterans. And I think that the world would like to hear about this. So if you don't mind, why don't you tell everybody about what you're involved with?
Several years ago, our company took over the management of a cemetery, a large cemetery, the biggest cemetery in our community. And I kind of volunteered to help them get the records in order, and things were not as they should have been. And so I was helping get things computerized and get the records all taken care of. And I ran across, by accident, kind of an obituary on a fella who died and was buried. He died in the early 60s or late 60s, or anyway, it didn't make any difference. But he was buried in the what was called then the paupers section. But he had an obituary, and I don't know who wrote the obituary, but the obituary said that he served in the Army during World War II and that he had 3 Bronze Stars. And it kind of bothered me. And I went down to look at his grave, and because I'm thinking, here's a guy that did something right in his life. You don't get a Bronze Star for doing nothing.
Yeah.
So I went down and looked at his grave, and there's no headstone. And I thought, wait a minute. And I'm poking around the grass thing, and he just didn't have one. And I thought, that's not right. Here's a guy that did something right when he was in the Army. Now, he may have ended up living under the bridge. I don't know. But at some point he did something right. So that got me thinking, how do I go about getting him a headstone? He didn't have one. He needs to have one. He deserved to have one. Long story short, I ended up after it took about a year and a half or so, and I got him a nice bronze headstone. We put it on a piece of granite and set it on his grave, and it made me feel good. He had no family. So there wasn't anybody, it didn't do anything for anybody except me. It made me feel good.
Well, it did something for him, though. That's cool.
But what I got to think, wait, if this guy's out here, there's 40,000 people buried in this cemetery. And if he's out here, how many other people might be out here, veterans, that are in the same boat? And so I said to the folks at cemetery, would you mind if I would just comb your cemetery records? I'm not going to hurt anything. Anyway, they didn't care. So I started going through records, and I would find a person, a veteran, that didn't have a headstone. Maybe I found an obituary that said something about him being a veteran, or maybe I just looked to see what his age was. He was born in 1921, which means, chances are, a good chance he would have been a veteran because he would have been that age. Or maybe he was born in 1845, or 1847, had to have been kind of Civil War stuff. So I started researching these people, and I would find people, maybe find a guy that didn't have a headstone. So I would research them, try to get enough information so I could send it to the federal government, to the Veterans Administration, and they would give us a headstone because the Veterans Administration will give any veteran a headstone. Okay. That's just what they do. So that's what I've been doing, is trying to find people who are buried out there in this one particular cemetery who are veterans whose graves aren't marked.
That's really incredible. I'm curious, how many have you found so far?
I found about 47, I think, so far that I've been able to get headstones for, everything from a dozen Civil War people to one Vietnam guy and everybody else in between.
Wow.
Spanish American War, World War I, World War II. So that's what I've been doing. And I'm doing it for myself because rarely do I find anybody that's got any family.
I think that is magnificent. What a wonderful thing you're doing.
I think so too. I'm just doing it for me.
Well, hey, and it keeps you busy retired, right?
Yeah, it gives me something, keeps me out of Needler's hair.
Dealing with death and as a funeral director, do you feel that that experience of seeing how precious life is on a daily basis, does it affect your political views? Like, do you find yourself being more conservative or more liberal?
I don't think being a funeral director has affected. I don't think it's affected my political views. I can tell you that I've somewhat changed over the years, and that, or I don't know that I've changed as much as I feel that politics has changed. I'm probably much more liberal now than I used to be. I registered in 1964 as a Republican because my dad told me to. And I voted for almost all Republican presidents. I've only voted for one Democrat, but I switched my party a few months ago to Democrat. I kept thinking I ought to just switch it to independent because I feel like I'm more of an independent person, but I didn't. I switched it to the Democratic Party, and I don't know that I'm really a Democrat, but I just don't like what's happening in the Republican Party. So.
Well, it's interesting because I have this conversation frequently with friends and on the show and whatnot. And I really feel personally like the Republican and Democratic parties, as much as people like to think that they exist, they really don't exist anymore. It's really just kind of two extremes. And then somewhere in the middle are the candidates we probably should be voting for, as far as I'm concerned.
That's right. But you just can't find them. You can't find those people.
No, correct. It's a shame. It really is a shame because that's what we need right now. We need someone in the middle to kind of balance out both sides,
I have coffee with a group, and they're all very conservative. I mean, very conservative people. I always joke about the fact that when I walk into the coffee group, they're all leaning so far to the right that they're going to fall out of their chair. But by the same token, I have had for the last 25 years lunch with a group every other week that are about to fall out of their chair to the left.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I've listened to these two different groups, and I just like to feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. I told some people the other day that they should be voting for people, but they're not. They're voting for a letter. I think there's too many people that vote for a letter. If it says R, that's who I'm going to vote.
Mm-hmm.
If it says D, that's where I'm going to vote. And I just cannot convince myself that I just need to get my ballot and vote for all one letter. I don't like to vote for letters. I like to vote for people.
Yeah, and people should vote not only for people, but for facts and not feelings. Yeah. And that's a tough thing to do.
Too many people don't do that.
Well, Fred, besides family and friends, what are you most passionate about in life today?
Well, I'm still a sports guy. I've been a sports guy all my life, I guess. But, well, I'm very passionate. I got to leave out my kids. I got to leave out my grandkids. So I play tennis. I love playing tennis, and I play tennis 2 or 3 times a week. I play pickleball 2 or 3 times a week. I love watching movies, and I love music. I love music. So I tell you what I like to do when it come wintertime, besides sitting here just watching movies, is I love to do jigsaw puzzles.
That's awesome.
And I'll have a table down there and I'll start putting a jigsaw puzzle together, and I can turn on my music and I can listen to, Willie Nelson or somebody and put my jigsaw puzzles together. I love doing that. So I guess my passion is just music and movies, and that's my passion, I guess, today, are those kind of things.
Now, do you have a favorite food?
Favorite food would be something like a good roast beef dinner with mashed potatoes and gravy and that kind of thing.
That sounds delicious. Now, if you were elected president of the United States today, what are the first three things you would do as President Holroyd?
I don't know how, but I would just try to get the country together. The country is we are so divided, but I don't know how I do that. See, that's my problem. And I'm not sure anybody else knows how to do it either. It just somehow or other try to get people to quit disliking people because of what color their skin is, or, because they're what their religion is and so forth. I mean, we get into that. I mean, people, I know these guys that I have coffee with in the morning, sometimes they get talking about the Muslims and how it's what a terrible bunch of people they are. And the guy that's the imam here in town is a friend of mine. His family was good people there. And I know people that belong to that mosque, and they're wonderful people. So I would try to get people together. But I just don't know how I'd do it, Dan.
Just to comment on that, I think the biggest thing that conservatives need to understand, there's a huge difference between a Muslim and a terrorist, and they are not the same thing.
Yeah, that's what I try to convince these guys. And no, but that's not. If you're so far right that you're falling out of your chair, they're not going to believe it.
I mean, the average Muslim is about as much a terrorist as the average Catholic is.
That's right.
And then there's extremists like Timothy McVeigh that are terrorists.
That's right.
We had them in our own country. So, yeah. All right. So first you're going to fix the divisiveness in our country. Yeah. What's the next two things you'd do?
We're going to try to figure out what to do about the poverty situation in our country. There's so much poverty, but then again, I hear people say, "Well, yeah, but even the poor people in this country are better off than the people in Rwanda, or so forth." Well, but that's not the point.
I agree. That's not the point.
The point is, let's do something about the poverty in our own country. And again, I don't know that you just take everybody. I don't have any problem with people making a lot of money. I mean, I think that's capitalism at work, and so I don't think you can take all of their money and divide it and give it to poor people. But I think I think the tax structure is not such that people who are very, very rich sometimes aren't paying much tax. Maybe we're starting to read about that all of a sudden, but I think I'd try to do something about the poverty.
Okay. So we got divisiveness and poverty. What's your third?
I think I'll go back to the tax link. Let's try to even out the taxes. If everybody pays their fair share of taxes, I think that infrastructure is huge, and it has to be fixed in this country too. And that's another big thing. And maybe that's part of the tax thing. Maybe people need to pay their fair share of taxes so we'd have more money for infrastructure.
President Holroyd, you have my vote. One of my favorite questions on the podcast to ask people is this one, which is, if you could sit down in a very old-timey, really cool pub for 4 hours with one person from all of human history, alive or dead, excluding anybody from your own family and any prophets like Jesus, Moses, or Muhammad, etc., who would you sit down with? What would you drink? And what would you ask them? First question you'd ask them.
The easiest answer to that is I'd probably drink coffee, because I don't drink anything that has alcohol in it. And that's just a personal thing of mine.
I'm a teetotaler myself, so.
I haven't been that way all my life, but that's how I am today. And I don't have any problem with people having a glass of wine, neither have a glass of wine and anything. But I'd probably drink a cup of coffee. And I'd love to visit with somebody who's very witty, like maybe a Mark Twain or a Will Rogers, people who are funny and they're witty. I'm trying to settle on one person, and I'm having a hard time doing that, Dan. I'd love to visit with Abraham Lincoln and just see what was going through his mind with the war and all the things that he had to deal with the slave states or the anti-slave states, and just see, how did you feel about that? He went through a lot of problems too. He lost his son, lost kids, and that's a hard question.
What's your guilty TV pleasure?
Old westerns, Western movies. I could watch Randolph Scott or Audie Murphy or John Wayne. I mean, I love that. I love those guys.
I heard a statistic once that the entire, like the old west of America, is looked at as this grandiose period, and there's all these movies and popular culture references and stuff. And people, I think, have this impression that there was this several hundred years of American history, and all of the old west was compacted into a term of about 80 years.
That's right.
That's crazy.
You're right. People think that it just lasted for decades and decades.
Yeah. Are you happy with the journey of life so far?
Absolutely. I am happy.
And if you could continue to live a healthy life, and I always stress that you stay healthy, how long do you think you'd like to live?
Right now, I always say, I want to live to see, I've got two grandchildren, and I'd really like to live long enough to see what they do, how they get along. When my granddaughter says that her goal in life is to be president, and she majors in politics, and she might do it. I don't know, but I'd like to see how far she goes. And my grandson is just starting on his college experience, and I would really like to live long enough and be aware enough to see what they do and how they get along, and see how successful they're going to become. So I won't put a time limit on it. My father's side of the family, there's never been a man that made it to 80.
Oh, wow.
And I'm 77. So there's been some women that made it. And my mother's side of the family, her oldest sister just died a couple years ago. She was 101. And my grandmother on that side of the family was 102. And so, there's longevity on her side of the family. So I try to take care of myself. I want to make it to 80, and I'm going to say, all right, to all my male ancestors, look what I did,
Yeah, broke the spell.
But it's going to take more than just 3 years. It's going to take more than just 3 years for me to see what my grandchildren become. So,
well, I hope you're around for many decades to come, my friend.
I do too.
If you could travel back in time and see yourself at, let's say, 20 years old, what would you tell your younger self? Anything special?
I don't know. I don't think so, because maybe I might tell myself to pay a little more attention to to what's going on in the world. I mean, I really never, I wasn't a person who cared much about politics or kind of what's going on in the world. But I don't know. I mean, I've had such a good life, and I can remember my younger years, and they were great. And I remember the 40s and the 30s and the 50s, and they've just all been good. So I don't know. Keep having a good time.
I love that. Keep having a good time. I love it. Fred, what do you think is the purpose of art?
Entertainment, communications, maybe. It communicates to different things to different people, but I think communication and just entertainment. We can walk into whatever kind of a gallery, an art gallery, or a sculpture, or symphony, or any kind of art, and I think you just want to be entertained, and you want the art, the painted picture or the sculpture to say something to you, to communicate with you.
What does success in life look like to you?
It looks like being happy where you are in life, being happy with who you are, being happy, being able to have a family that everybody gets along. Because I've seen so much over the years of people who didn't get along as I've dealt with families. So just success is just being happy with where you're at in life, and I am.
Do you have a spirit animal?
I don't know. Maybe a hawk. A hawk is a spirit animal. They can see things all around them. They can see things from a different perspective than just somebody that's on the ground. They kind of like the freedom. I think maybe a hawk.
And the question I've been waiting to ask you for the entire interview, you ready? You who has worked around it your entire life, are you afraid of dying?
I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm fearful of dying taking too long, because as I've seen people, I had a friend of mine just died a couple of days ago, and he suffered 2 strokes, and he just laid and didn't know what was going on, I think I'm fearful of that kind of a death, but I don't know that I'm afraid of dying. But I just don't want to die before I see what these kids are going to do, and I'm just fearful of the kind of death that some people have. Some of it's not very pleasant.
Well, speaking of your grandkids and your kids, let's say 30, 40 years from now, the grandkids are adults and you're gone. What would you like to say to them if they listen to this podcast and you want to address them specifically from beyond?
I just like to say how proud I am of who you are and what you've accomplished and where you are in life, and just remember that to just love as much as you can and love people and love your family. And I guess that's all.
Well, Fred, the last thing we do on the show is a little game I have called 299 Philosophical and Life Questions with Moonbird. I have 299 questions on a list here numbered from 1 to 299, and they're things I've collected from friends and family and the internet. And I let every guest pick 2 numbers at random, and I'm going to ask you those 2 questions. What are your 2 numbers?
27.
27, and what other one?
74.
All right, 27 and 74. Here we go. 27. What kind of parent do you think you've been?
I think I've been a good parent. I think I've been an understanding. I don't think I've been a bad parent. I think I've been a good parent. I think that's the answer.
Okay. 74. If you could change one thing about yourself, what would it be?
I would be a little more, I would try to be a person who loves to sit down and read, because I don't like to read, and I wish I did, because neither reads a lot. Everybody I know just say, I go to play tennis some morning and they'll say, what's the last book you read? I don't know. I think I read something by Willie Nelson or something, but to roll me up and smoke me when I die, or something like that. And I would like to change myself to where I could sit down and read and enjoy it.
Mr. Fred Holroyd, thank you so much for joining us today and having this candid discussion about life and death. And I certainly hope that you are around for many years to come, that you pass the 80-year-old deadline, and that you pass it by a large margin, I'd like to say, and you're around for your grandkids for decades to come. It's always such a pleasure to see you and talk to you, and very much my heartfelt love to you and Nidra. And thanks for being here.
Okay, come see us.
You got it, partner.
Yeah.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale.
Friends and listeners, thank you as always. And while you're contemplating your own mortality and existence, why don't you head on over to patreon.com/Moonbird, because life is too short not to support the arts. And even $1 really helps me keep this show going. Patreon.com/Moonbird. And if you'd like even more Moonbird than that in your life, and hey, who wouldn't? Head on over to memoriesofamoonbird.com or visit me on social media at Memories of a Moonbird. Be excellent to each other and stay safe.